Good morning, Your Excellencies, Mr. Jun Yamazaki, Ambassador of Japan to Singapore, Mrs. Huang Tao, Ambassador of Vietnam to Singapore, Mr. Arai Yusuke, Minister and Deputy Chief of Mission, Embassy of Japan in Singapore, representatives from the various embassies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Seraphin Cheong, Director of Operations at the Singapore Institute of International Affairs. A very warm welcome to the SWA's webinar, Financing Quality Infrastructure in ASEAN. The SWA has the pleasure of organizing this webinar with the support of the Embassy of Japan in Singapore. For those who are new to us, the SWA is Singapore's oldest and independent think tank. We were established in 1962, and today we focus our policy analysis in two areas, ASEAN and sustainability. When we look at ASEAN's recovery from COVID-19, one often thinks of infrastructure, but the challenge lies in financing these projects. Today, we have with us three renowned speakers who will share with us their perspectives on what the current infrastructure initiatives in ASEAN are. Why is there a funding gap? What may change as a result of the pandemic? As well as how can public-private partnership schemes promote financial governance and financial sustainability in regional infrastructure projects? Our speakers are Dr. Masahiro Kawai, Representative Director and Director General, Economic Research Institute for Northeast Asia, and Professor Emeritus, University of Tokyo. Dr. Fumiharu Miyano, Deputy Director and Professor of Economics, Center for Southeast Asian Studies, Kyoto University. Ms. Audra Loh, CEO of Clifford Capital. Moderating today's session is Associate Professor Simon Tay, Chairman of the SWA. Each speaker will have about 10 minutes to present their perspectives. Following that, we will have the opportunity for a question and answer session. Should you wish to share your questions or views, please use the raise hands function or type them in the chat. To formally start the webinar, may I invite His Excellency, Mr. Jun Yamazaki, Ambassador of Japan to Singapore, as well as Associate Professor Tay to deliver their opening addresses. Ambassador, please.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to really thank this opportunity. Professor Simon Tay, Chairman of Singapore Institute of International Affairs, fellow speakers, Dr. Kawai, Dr. Mieno, and Ms. Loh, participants who are zooming in to this webinar event, welcome. At the outset, I would like to say that the Embassy of Japan is delighted to be able to support today's event, Financing Quality Infrastructure in ASEAN, organized by the distinguished Singapore Institute of International Affairs, led by my good friend, Professor Simon Tay. I'm also delighted, I'm also very happy to be able to deliver an opening remark. Infrastructure underpins economic prosperity in ASEAN. Infrastructure is key to promoting inclusive growth and stable development in the region. Connectivity is an important element of infrastructure. And we know that ASEAN is at the center of thriving and important Indo-Pacific region. It is also important to keep in mind sustainability when we talk about infrastructure. That means the project needs to be mindful of the environment, the surrounding community, as well as governance structures, and be guided by a sense of fairness, transparency, and a long-term perspective. Looking at the situation on the ground, we see that the ASEAN region still faces massive infrastructure financing gap. Mobilizing private capital will be key. With what I just mentioned in mind, the government of Japan continues to contribute in a major way to support development of infrastructure in the ASEAN region through its Official Development Assistance, ODA, as well as other means. It promotes quality in infrastructure investments to support sustainable growth in the region. In June 2019, last year, at the G20 Osaka Summit, chaired by then Prime Minister Abe, the summit adopted the G20 principles for quality infrastructure investment, which highlights key concepts such as life cycle cost, building resilience against natural disaster risks, and strengthening infrastructure governance. 5 months after that, in November last year, the joint statement of the 22nd ASEAN-Japan Summit on connectivity was issued. At that Japan-ASEAN Summit meeting in Thailand, Japan announced its initiative on overseas loan and investment for ASEAN, aiming to mobilize $3 billion from public and private sectors over the following 3 years, that is 2020 to 2022. To facilitate private investment, Japan is promoting various schemes to improve the environment for such investments and reduce investment risks. It is promoting public-private partnerships, PPP, and is supporting capacity building in the area of financial markets and financial authorities. Turning to another important point, the free and open Indo-Pacific concept that Japan attaches importance to also enhances the efforts to advance infrastructure in the region. The concept aims to develop a free and open Indo-Pacific region as international public goods through ensuring rules-based international order in a comprehensive, inclusive, and transparent manner. The concept attaches importance to the centrality and unity of ASEAN. Its aim is to secure peace and prosperity in the region. Japan will cooperate with any country that supports this concept. We believe it is very much in line with the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. As a final word, in his policy speech in Vietnam last week, made during his first overseas official trip, the Japanese Prime Minister, Mr. Suga Yoshihide, stated that Japan will continue to support the endeavors of the ASEAN countries to strengthen mutual connectivity within the region and to develop together in the region. This statement is a strong reaffirmation of what Japan has strived to do and will continue to pursue with regard to its relations with our important ASEAN partners. I think I will stop here. I will look forward to hearing from the speakers their views on this important subject that is to be discussed today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Professor Tay, can I invite you to provide your opening address and to also—
Good morning, Your Excellencies, especially Ambassador Jun Yamazaki. I thank you very much for your partnership in coming forward with this panel and that of your colleague at the embassy, including Arai-san. We appreciate very much your consistent and help and support. The panelists, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I will say a few words as organizer and then just deliver 3 or 4 points to share with you before we start the panel. I wish to really thank all the excellencies for joining us in this discussion. One thing about webinar, while it's efficient, we can't really see the audience, or the audience can't see themselves. So I wish to just tell the people who are gathered that we actually have a very good turnout from a number of the leading companies of Singapore, including some Japanese regional overseas headquarters here, that really look quite directly at infrastructure and or financing. So there's a lot of expertise in the room, which we hope to tap during the question and answer. The SFIA has been working on infrastructure in the last 2+ years, really as a kind of conjunction of where the politics of ASEAN countries and the geopolitics meets with the questions of economic opportunity, finance, and increasingly sustainability. We've had a number of discussions this year on these topics, and we're delighted today to have the opportunity to zoom in a little bit on the Japanese commitment and perspectives on this key issue for the region. Allow me to share a few opening thoughts. I'll pick about 5 quickly. First, as Yamazaki-san has said, there's a clear need for infrastructure. It is clearly a source of growth, not just for itself, but as a factor to bring the different economic sectors together and to bring different countries together for closer cooperation. Beyond the economy, infrastructure clearly helps social development and build resilient communities. And this aspect is ever more important as we look at what COVID and the pandemic has done to our region. There are greater challenges today than ever before. This is not only in the health infrastructure, but other supporting sectors such as telecommunication networks, logistics, which have seen a huge surge in demand. So the need is clearly there. And yet, many of the countries will have to use their limited budgets for the pandemic emergency responses. As such, while the need for infrastructure is there, the ability of governments to pay for this out of budget will be more constrained than ever before. And this brings me to the second point. My second point is that we really need regional cooperation. Often, when we look at these projects, they're so big that they occupy a huge priority on the national agenda. And oftentimes, it is just one donor, including China's Belt and Road Initiative, which will be prominent for good reasons or controversial ones. The key part I hope we will discuss is how we can knit together a much more regional approach, that there is a master plan for ASEAN connectivity, MPAC 2025, that really helps coordinate the different infrastructure plans within countries of the ASEAN group. And it will also take the help, support, and coordination with some of our key partners, including Japan, to get this ASEAN-wide connectivity going. And we're delighted to hear that Suga-san has, the Prime Minister of Japan, Suga-san, has reinforced this in his just recent visit to the present ASEAN chairman and one of the key economies, Vietnam. The third point I'd like to make is, as we try to get these regional cooperation programs going, there are rules and market-based values which are critical to bring to the picture. Bankability will be the key, and therefore the private sector will have to play a critical role in making this work and work well. When we look across the region, we often see weak legal and regulatory frameworks, poor project planning, and lack capacity for execution, as well as the broad geopolitical concerns. What we need to move towards are harmonized standards, transparency, and a rules-based framework. And Japan, in this way, has put forward a very interesting combination of the finance and certain values, looking for quality. And I was delighted to hear in his opening remarks, Ambassador Yamazaki emphasize how within these principles and the right values, Japan will work with any country. And that is a very critical concept in principle. I welcome it. My next point is that in this search for values, etc., I think the new and emerging emphasis is on sustainability. Never more has ESG, environment, social, and governance issues, been more at front than when we look at the pandemic. And even as we look forward to climate change and other challenges coming up, we can see that this factor will grow increasingly for companies receiving the infrastructure, as well as investors from the private sector looking to make those commitments. So in this sense, I think this is really the value framework that's emerging. Let me move on to my last point, and this is about digitalization. Oftentimes we talk about traditional hard infrastructure, and there's certainly a lot of need for it still in our region. But the pandemic, I think, has exposed and accelerated demand for the digitalization of our economy, digital services and online shopping, et cetera, et cetera. And much more than that, we will need to have the tech-related infrastructure. to support this increased demand and growth opportunities, to really future-proof and crisis-proof our infrastructure to serve this new economy that can knit the region even closer together. Lastly, in closing, let me say Singapore is a small country, but one that has a certain expertise in infrastructure. We've done quite well for our small country. And we are a key investor and partner for many of the countries in ASEAN. We also have a very strong finance sector, which I think is looking for opportunities to do good, but also do well for their businesses. And I think in this light, we hope that Singapore can play a small role with partners like Japan and our friends in ASEAN to really help bring the region together in terms of infrastructure. Thank you very much. Now I will shift my role to moderator. I've been kindly asked to help chair the session. I must say that when I was preparing my opening remarks, I was a bit nervous because there is a lot of intelligence in the room, a lot of knowledge, and none more so than our first speaker. Masahiro Kawai-san is now with the Economic Research Institute for Northeast Asia at the University of Tokyo. He has been for a long time a close friend of Asia and ASEAN as head of the ADB Institute. Kawai-san has prepared a very extensive and detailed presentation, and I think I should not take up more time and ask him to present it, please. Kawai-san.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Simon Tay. I am very happy to be here to make a presentation. I have a PowerPoint, which I want to share with you. I hope you can, everybody can see my presentation on the screen. So I want to talk about quality infrastructure investment for ASEAN connectivity. ASEAN and Japan have had very close economic relationships, and they share a lot of common values, and infrastructure connectivity is a very important instrument which would strengthen bilateral relationship between Japan and ASEAN. So first, I want to show some data. Japan-ASEAN investment relationship. The left-hand side upper panel shows top 10 destinations of Japan's outward foreign direct investment in terms of stocks. ASEAN is a very important region for Japan after the US and EU. Now, from the ASEAN perspective, top 10 sources of inward foreign direct investment include EU 28, US, and Japan. So in terms of country basis, Japan is the second largest country from which ASEAN receives foreign direct investment in terms of stock. So between Japan and ASEAN, investment relationship has been very, very strong. In terms of Japan's FDA, the country allocations are somewhat different. Japan invests very heavily in Singapore, Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines. And on a country basis, from individual countries' perspectives, the presence of Japan as a foreign investor is very strong also. Now, infrastructure investment needs are huge in Asia. For Asia as a whole, between 2016 and 2030, about 26 trillion US dollars would be needed for investment. Annually, 1.7 investment needs. In the case of Southeast Asia, annual average need would be 210 billion, according to the 2017 ADB study. Now that's the investment needs. The actual investment is smaller than the needs, and gap is there. For Asia as a whole, the gap in terms of GDP, annual gap is 5%, excluding China. In the case of ASEAN, about 4% of GDP would have to be invested. And looking at the future, public investment is very important, but also private investment. Private investment is important, perhaps even more important. And Japan has been focusing on quality infrastructure investment. As Ambassador Yamazaki has pointed out, so from about 2015, Japan has been focusing on the need for quality infrastructure investment. And at the G20 Osaka summit, the G20 leaders adopted 6 principles. Maximizing the positive impact of infrastructure to achieve sustainable growth and development. The second is raising economic efficiency in view of life cycle cost. Now, life cycle cost means that the cost includes not only initial investment costs, but the future cost for repairment, maintenance, and sustaining the function of infrastructure. If initial investment is too small, then future costs of repairs or maintenance can be huge. And politicians may want to focus on just initial costs. Politicians may want to minimize initial costs because in the future, those politicians may not be in place. So pushing the burden to the future. But that's not good. Japan's approach is to minimize life cycle costs, including maintenance and repairs, which may require somewhat a significant amount of investment initially. Environmental considerations, very important, resilience, and social consideration, and governance. Governance is a very important part because openness and transparency of procurement is very important, and debt sustainability. This is a very important part of G20 principles. Japan has been pursuing initiatives to support Asian infrastructure investment. This picture is a bit complicated, but what this means is that Japan utilizes official development assistance instruments. Japan works with ADB, and also Japan through policy institutions and policy banks provides capital investment instruments. And in doing so, private participants are encouraged to join. So combining public support and private investment, PPP infrastructure investment has been a focus of the Japanese approach. And the free and open Indo-Pacific vision has been a very important way of looking at Asia and Pacific, and also the Indian Rim area, Indian Ocean Rim area. So free and open Indo-Pacific was proposed by former Prime Minister Abe in 2016. And there are three pillars in that initiative: rule of law, freedom of navigation, and free trade. The second is economic prosperity. Third is peace and stability. Now, the second pillar, which is a pursuit of economic prosperity, includes improving connectivity and strengthening economic partnership. And connectivity includes, in the case of ASEAN, East-West Economic Corridor and Southern Economic Corridor in the GMS region, and other parts of Indo-Pacific region. There are other regional initiatives. And Japan is also supporting economic partnership as part of Indo-Pacific vision for economic prosperity, including RCEP, CPTPP. Singapore is a member, Brunei, Vietnam, Malaysia, among ASEAN countries. And Japan's vision is try to invite other regional countries into CPTPP. Now, Japan's connectivity initiatives, there are many connectivity initiatives in ASEAN and also in South Asia, in the Indo-Pacific region. I just want to just briefly talk about two projects supported by Japan as PPP. The first one is Tirawa Special Economic Zone Development. The second one is Lac Nguyen International Gateway Port in Vietnam. Tirawa project is in Myanmar, about 30 kilometers south of Yangon. JICA has been financing SEZ development projects, supporting infrastructure projects, and the private sector is now operating the industrial park. And as part of that, the Tirawa area port has been expanded by the support of Japanese ODA yen loan, and also Japanese private sector participation. The Japanese yen loan has been supporting the construction of terminals and cargo handling equipment. And the private sector, which is a port management company, is now working. So there is a combination of Japanese ODA and private sector participation. By the way, in the case of private sector participation, there is another Japanese institution called JOIN, which is a investment arm of the Japanese government that has also participated together with the private sector. In Vietnam, Lac Nguyen port construction, that's also about 30 kilometers away from Haiphong. And the idea is to use Japanese ODA to develop the construction of the port, and port operation is done by a consortium of private companies where Japanese companies also participate. To summarize, ASEAN and Japan are highly interdependent through trade, investment, finance, and other exchanges. And they have mutually close feelings and confidence and trust in each other. In the case of ASEAN, IC's Yusuf Ishak Institute annually publish survey result. And there is ASEAN has very strong confidence and trust in Japan. And the Japanese government conducts opinion surveys on a sense of closeness to major countries. So Southeast Asia is the third highest country after the US and EU in terms of a sense of closeness. So the two sides have very good relationship, and ASEAN is, of course, a very important region for the Japanese economy. And from the perspective of Japan supporting ASEAN in various ways, including infrastructure connectivity, it provides a benefit for Japan also, because the growth of ASEAN contributes to the growth of Japan. And so it's a win-win, strengthening high quality infrastructure and investment and connectivity is a very important part of this collaboration. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. As always, very informative, both broad strokes as well as details. I like the way you emphasize the win-win cooperation. And certainly when I was an advisor for two major Japanese corporations globally, I found that, to my delight, ASEAN was a major part of their plans. And in fact, the last few years have seen Japan-ASEAN engagement and investment actually increase significantly. And as you said, looking for the higher quality investment. Thank you very much. Our second speaker is Fumiharu Miyano, Deputy Director and Professor of Economics, Center for Southeast Asian Studies in Kyoto University. Dr. Miyano's research areas cover the financial system in particular, and Southeast Asia, especially Thailand and Myanmar, which Kawai-san already referred to. Fumiharu-san, will you please take over the microphone?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I'm sharing that my material. Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Tei. I'm Fumiharu Miyano from Kyoto University. It's my honor to talk at this seminar. Here, I would like to talk about the Japan's experience on cooperation for constructing financial infrastructures and the system in ASEAN, with some focus on the Myanmar and the Laos cases, in which I participated in the, before. Okay. Oh, sorry, I started in the middle. Yeah. Okay. First of all, the financial channel is a crucial factor for constructing and maintaining the high quality infrastructures. But when we consider the nexus of the infrastructure to growth strategy itself, it's also a crucial factor for industrialization process, which is a goal of the infrastructure construction. Infrastructure investment itself is largely financed by the public source, like policy-based finance or official development assistance, while the development of the export-oriented manufacturing, coming after in the parallel of the infrastructure investment, largely depend on the function of the domestic financial system led by mainly a private sector, a financial sector. In this sense, we always need to consider that public-private finance mix policies on these issues. The other point is that the agenda of supporting finance for growth probably consists of two aspects. One is an issue of how how to control the macroeconomic and the capital flow conditions in broad sense. And other is how to enhance the domestic financial system in each country. Okay. I'd like to show that some example of that the Japanese involvement, commitment to the cooperation on finance in ASEAN countries. Well-known effort is the Asian Financial Cooperation Schemes in ASEAN +3 multilateral framework. And this is at has been organized, led by the Japanese government in early 2000s. There's twofold work, I think. One is that the currency cooperation, known as the Chenmo Initiative. It is a currency swap scheme for the foreign exchange currencies. It started in the bilateral cooperation to nowadays at multilateral schemes. And in 2011, that the monitoring unit, named AMRO, was established in Singapore. Although there's no experience with the result of this scheme since establishment, but the continuous dialogue, cross dialogue among the member authorities and the professional and the economist itself is that the very important outcome to control that the capital flow. And the other one is that the bond market development issues. This is known as ABUMI works schemes. And this is mostly mainly consists of technical assistant for network system construction and regulation and rule and rating agencies, so forth. The focus is that in the early stage of government bond oriented, but now the target is expanded to the corporate bond issues. In 2010, the Credit Guarantee Investment Facility was established in the ADB. The Professor Kawai, the first presenter, is that actually led this organizations and actually one of the founder of this institution. And looking at that, the achievement of this bond market development, however, the achievement varies among the countries. And in China, Korea, Thailand, it's very remarkable of the development of bond market. But other countries that so or the unchanged, it depend on the countries, I think. And the one unexpected favorable effect was that a kind of spillover effect for not only on the bond market, but also to the securities market as whole, or even the banking, financial sector, the banking sectors. So that the designing and the supporting that the basic rule and basic system is that not the it is beneficial not only for the banking bond market, but to that the other financial aspect of the financial system. Okay, and the other type of that the Japanese cooperation on finance in ASEAN is more direct financial infrastructure development. It is mainly carried under the Japanese ODS scheme, JICA, and involved by the ministries and many types. One picking up one example, a cooperation to Myanmar in 2011. Since 2011, that is at the period of the reform in Myanmar. And at that time, Myanmar has many challenges in the financial system, unifying the multiple exchange system and creating interbank market and establishing a bank regulation framework as a whole. Japan's commitment on this the challenges that the one that about the financial infrastructure. Japan provided the support, technical assistance, and also ODAs to the bank network system and facilities in the among the central bank and commercial banks. And the more famous one is that the commitment to the establishment of the securities exchange. Yangon Security Exchange started operating 2015. Many technical assistance and investment. And actually, that currently that 49% of the stake are Japanese side at the establishment and nowadays. And the other type of the cooperation that is about that the dialogue and advice of the financial system, joint survey advice or grand design to how that the financial system should be. It related to that the role of policy-based finance, for example, or the new entry policy with the commercial banking sector inside and outside the country. And also this involves that many capacity building associated with the financial regulation and rules. Okay. These efforts were, however, actually that not very easy work. What we learned there from that is that about the financial infrastructures. It is very simple. Device creation itself is more or less feasible, possible, but it doesn't automatically bring active market transaction. It's a very, very simple fact. For example, that foreign exchange market and interbank market, there is a very, very competitive black market exists. And they are in a sense and efficient, sophisticated, and very competitive. The replacement is not so easy. It's a very gradual. It improved, but it's very gradual process. And as for the securities market, after establishing securities exchange in Yangon, we found that the not many companies, firms are willing to go public. So that we usually need to think about that the demand side and the supply side and its balance, the balance of the monies. In the current situation is that it's very inactive, or that the motivation to list it for the company side. And the financial system designs the lesson and in this type of the discussion cooperation is that we really know that understand that no standard practice exists. Optimal solution depend on the nature of each country, country by country. The Japanese experience not directly applicable, and any other Asian countries' experience are not very directly applicable. Actually, that the experience in Asia in financial systems is very diverse, very diverse. Singapore is the one example, Japan is the one example, Korea is the example, and Thailand the example. So maybe probably we need that more and more deeper and deeper discussions and the essence of the financial system development. Okay, and emerging the agendas. Very recently years, I'm involved in the policy research and dialogue program in Laos, the Lao economy, and come to know that some newly emerging point, newly coming, newly the problem, new problem that is coming to, which is coming serious and serious now, even before the pandemic period. One is that the trend of the fiscal expenditure expansion backed by the external debt increase and a kind of uncontrollable public investment of infrastructures. It's found that many countries, not only the Laos, but in the case of Laos, that it just seems largely related to the Belt and Road Initiative by China. And in mid 2010 that the government faced that a layer to payment to the construction companies. Such kind of problems occurs. And another point I found is on this project is that, yeah, again, that the domestic banking system was very, very weak and vulnerable. In case of Laos, the banking sector suffers from the over concentration of state banks, very low capital adequacy, and too large presence of capital, foreign capital. So to overcome the variable local banking system, it is a very important agenda of the financial cooperation. And this is at the basis for that stable financial system as a fourth system. And again, probably a type of the spillover effect of that particular facilities like a bond market or securities market. These are the very big spillover effect. This is one way of our approach.
Dr.
Okay.
Moreno, sorry to interrupt. 2 minutes, please.
Okay. The quick conclusion is again that the one the point is that there are 2 points. One is that how to cope with the worsening external debt issues. At the probably this is the way that enhancing transparency of ODA and capital flow, and the standardizing the common norms and the rules among the multilateral donors, in particular including China. And another one is comprehensive support or strengthening domestic financial system with a knowledge from the experience in Northeast Asia and the Southeast Asia, or for runners ASEAN. And this is at lastly, this is at one possible picture of the evolution of Asian financial cooperation schemes. Probably 2 of the cooperation topics should be more extended to a better dialogue place, and also a supply channel for long-term capital beyond the bond market, and also focus to that the development of banking system in the rest of the ASEAN countries. That is my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Fumiharu-san. Getting turn to my third speaker, Audra Loh, the CEO of Clifford Capital. Clifford Capital is a private company here in Singapore, but they, in a way, play a large role in providing public goods as kind of a quasi-Exim Bank function that looks at a lot of the projects and financing from Singapore. Of course, I hope that's an adequate introduction to a company, but I'll leave Audra to do more, or to also share her points with us in response to a lot of what Kawai-san and Fumiharu-san have said. Please, Audra, please.
Okay, all right. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to SIIA for inviting us to be a part of this discussion. I'm Audra Loh. I am the CEO of Clifford Capital. I will add a little bit more to what Simon has just said, which may be beneficial for some of you who may not have heard of us. We are a specialist provider of structured finance and project finance debt solutions. We serve as a policy lender for the Singapore government, supporting Singapore-based companies in infrastructure and also in the maritime sector. Typically, these companies would be looking to invest in or export to overseas markets. And these are the opportunities where we come in to provide financing to support these initiatives. By Singapore-based companies, we actually include support for companies that have substantial presence in Singapore. So in fact, we have had collaborated with some Japanese companies also in the past. So in essence, right, what we do is actually somewhat similar to export credit agencies and Exim banks from other countries. Where we are a little bit different is that we have to operate strictly on a commercial basis. Clifford Capital is a part of the Clifford Capital Holdings Group, which is in turn owned by Temasek, the ADB, and various banks and insurance companies, including Standard Chartered, SMBC, DBS, Prudential, and Manulife. So I think for Clifford Capital, we've been in business for about 8 years now. In the last 8 years, we've financed a wide range of infrastructure projects around the world, including the first internationally financed independent power projects in Myanmar. We've also financed some ports in Turkey and in Panama, wind farms, solar plants in India, a rail company in the US, and closer to home, we are also financing an LPG terminal that is in Malaysia. As a long-term project finance lender, we would, as a default, be looking to finance quality infrastructure, as this provides a basis for our debt to be repaid over the next 10, 15, 20 years. But quality can be a subjective notion. And as much as it's nice to enjoy top-of-the-line facilities, very often gold-plated assets are not always needed. Value for money is an important consideration for procuring governments. And while competitive tendering can get you the best price, you have to be careful that contractors do not end up cutting corners in order to preserve their bottom line. So for financiers like us, what do we look for when we decide to support and finance infrastructure projects? We do a huge amount of due diligence. The amounts that we deploy in financing these infrastructure projects are not small, and typically the payback periods are extremely long. So I'll just highlight a couple of things that we look for in terms of explaining what quality infrastructure means to us. So the first, when we look at these projects, is we look for a reputable and responsible sponsor that will stand behind in developing these projects. That's extremely important because with these good sponsors, that's how you really bring about good quality in these infrastructure projects. We also ensure, in turn, the sponsors employ good contractors that will build these projects properly, to spec, and on time. In addition to building good quality infrastructure, we also make sure that sponsors have a plan to maintain the facilities properly for the long term. That means appropriate life cycle renewals, replacements over the duration of the project. And we do all of this with the help of technical experts, because clearly us bankers don't know much about technical aspects of the project. And we also want to make sure that projects are fit for purpose and are designed based on enduring specifications. So just to give some examples, if we're building a waste-to-energy plant, we have to make sure that the waste profile is not going to change materially over the years. That way, the plant can operate efficiently within its design specifications. Another example, if we're financing a wind project, we want to make sure that the project siting has been done properly with sufficient historical wind mass data, so that we can be sure that when erected, the turbines will be spinning and generating electricity, as opposed to just sitting there decorating the landscape. Other than these things, we also do look for other aspects, such as the performance considerations on the part of government off-takers. Concessions are contracts where we do rely on many parties to perform various obligations. And one of these parties, an important one, is often the government. And typically, government as off-takers for infrastructure projects, as well as to deliver certain other parts that could make the project work. So another example to sort of bring this to life, a power plant is useless without a reliable transmission grid that can evacuate the power that it generates. And very often the grids are built and managed by governments, while power plants are operated by the private sector. But if the government doesn't ensure that the grid has the sufficient capacity to support the power generated, then these plants effectively can't operate. And we've actually seen these concerns surface in real life. For example, in places like Vietnam, with some of the new solar projects, particularly since these projects introduce a level of intermittency that you don't see with baseload plants. And this has created certain stress to the grid, leading in some cases to curtailment. So that would be a concern for financiers, because curtailment means you can't earn the revenues that would then be used to repay debt. So quality is really something that everyone has a part to play in bringing to the table. The final point that I'll talk about is on ESG and sustainability. Simon, as you said, this is something that has really been brought to the fore. It has also brought a whole new dimension to what constitutes quality infrastructure. In the past, people have not talked too much about things like emissions and carbon intensity. Of course, today, a very different picture is starting to emerge. As we transition to a greener future, the most obvious steps are in replacing fossil fuels with solar, wind, other renewable sources of energy. But to me, what is more interesting is that people are also starting to approach the subject in a much more holistic manner. For example, we are starting to think about whether raw materials are sustainably sourced. I think this is by no means an easy endeavor, and it represents a huge commitment from all parties, and it would require a pretty broad-based mindset change. So I think it's going to be quite interesting to see how things would evolve from here. For financiers like ourselves, I do believe that we have a role in driving adoption and in some cases exclusion, as we have seen in the case of coal-fired power plants. With new concepts that have come about, such as distributed power, virtual PPAs, financiers also have to keep up in order to make sure that we continue to structure the right types of financing to support this new style infrastructure projects. So I think that about sums up some of the things that we financiers think about when we say quality infrastructure. And certainly it's gratifying to see that some of my points are overlapping with some of the points that have been noted by my colleagues on this panel earlier. I think that just goes to show that we all have a role in, in delivering quality infrastructure in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Audra.
Yeah.
With that, we can come into the question and answer period. I've got some questions, and normally I stick them in first as the chairman, but I see a friend on the question and answer panel. He's Ong Nai Oo, Permanent Secretary for the Ministry of Foreign Investment in Myanmar. And Myanmar was referenced to several times, in fact, by all three speakers. So Ong Nai Oo's question is, kind of regulatory framework and incentives should be provided to companies in Myanmar to go public more? And this is particularly, of course, to a point that Haru-san brought up when he mentioned the Yangon Stock Exchange. A very beautiful building, but you're right, a bit empty and lifeless at the moment. But if I could broaden Ong Nai Oo's very good question, I think particularly for the infrastructure space, what do you all think for developing countries like Myanmar or Laos? What are the options for them to really raise the capital base domestically? Haru-san has mentioned the challenges for the domestic financial systems. I'd like to hear from Audra and Kawai-san, especially the possibility of using bonds or other instruments in third countries to supplement the national systems. So please, Haru-san, can we start with you perhaps more directly on Ong Nai Oo's question about Myanmar and the Yangon Stock Exchange?
Okay, thank you very much. And can I answer the first? Yes, and encouraging the company to go public is a standard way is a tax incentive, like in the Thailand, the public companies are reduced the corporate tax, but that the function, the effect is very limited. I think actually that it takes time to increase that listed companies, the public companies, in the experience from the experience of Thailand and Vietnam. So one thing, possible way to encourage that increase that the listed companies, that probably a strategic way focusing on specific sector, like on the SMEs, state-owned enterprises, or banking sector itself. Banking sector is a case that experience in Thailand in 1970s, that it's a compulsive way, not an incentive, that the government made a rule to be published or something. And actually that the pure private family business is that generally reluctant to be published. So the policy should be a mixture with that incentive and the compulsion, I think. And probably another possibility is that the focus on that venture business, a small venture business, to make to design that the scheme or specialize on the venture small SMEs, And because they have the large demand for the fund in the market, they're not their own self capital is very limited. That is my front answer to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Would either Kawai-san or Audra like to comment directly on Myanmar?
Yeah, just a very quick intervention. I think there are only a small number of companies listed in Yangon Stock Exchange, 6 or so companies, very small. And I understand that the authorities are now trying to encourage more listings. And I think they are now considering to set up a arrangement to encourage companies which are actually allowed to sell their equity outside of the Yangon Stock Exchange to upgrade disclosures and various standards, governance standards, so that they would be listed. I think they are now thinking about setting up a pre-listing board or something. I think that's a very good idea. There are almost 300 such companies, I understand, and also foreign-owned enterprises can be encouraged to list. Of course, banks and other traditional big companies. I think the issue is how can those companies make themselves more transparent in terms of financial information.
I think you're very correct. The Singapore Exchange and friends like Prime Partners have also told me that really for listing, there's a need for a whole culture and a whole supporting services and efforts of advisory firms, of auditing, of to really make it ready for really much more companies to come up and list for public funds. But if I could pull you into the infrastructure space in particular, given the large amounts of capital needed for infrastructure often, do you think that external funding, like the bond market you mentioned, in third countries, whether in Tokyo or Singapore or Hong Kong or wherever, might these be a partial solution to the financing gap if the national systems are not strong enough yet?
Right, absolutely. When domestic financing is not sufficient, when the domestic financial system is not strong enough, countries have to rely on external funding using bond markets or various types of financial instruments. But as Mr. Mieno emphasized, debt management is a very important issue for countries, particularly under the pressure of COVID-19. Everybody is now getting, shrinking, and governments are under pressure. So debt management is very important. That's why debt sustainability issue is very, very important. And PPP framework has to be a very credible framework. As I explained in the case of Japan, the Japanese approach is kind of very conservative approach towards PPP. But I think that's a way to go because of the downward pressure on everybody under COVID-19. But still, private capital is there and planning very good PPP projects. This time still relying on external funding, but paying sufficient attention to the ability to repay out of projects. I think that's doable.
Thank you, Kawai-san. You mentioned private sector capital. And I think there's a good point to bring Audra in. I've been told before there's plenty of money in the world today in the private sector.
Right.
What's your view about it, some of it finding its way into Myanmar to help infrastructure?
Yeah, I was
Right.
about to say that obviously across ASEAN, we've got quite a wide variation in terms of the development profile of the different countries. I think that for a place like Myanmar, to go straight into the bond markets, it's probably a little bit more challenging at this point in time. There are other sources of capital available for markets like Myanmar. And I think that the multilateral development banks, for example, some of the various ECAs or Exim banks from other countries, including someone like ourselves that have a similar role, we, alongside some of the commercial banks, have probably a much bigger role to play in financing the infrastructure projects in these countries. And the reason is because a lot of these institutions are a lot more accustomed to lending to emerging markets. They understand the risks associated with the lending to these markets, much more so than institutional investors. One of our sister companies have done a project finance loan securitization, and through that exercise, have spoken to a lot of institutional investors to understand what their appetite is for emerging market infrastructure debt. And what we found is that, I think most of that appetite is strong for developed markets with established regulatory frameworks, a certain level of transparency. That appetite dries up very quickly the minute you go into emerging markets. So, which is why for us, that securitization idea worked in terms of bringing in some of these capital that may not otherwise be looking at this region. So I think in short, there is definitely a lot of money out there. You just have to find different means to mobilize this capital. I agree with Kawai-san that PPPs are a very good way to underpin some of these projects. And with the right structure, the money will come.
If I could draw you out a bit more, Audra, on 2 points. One is the transparency point you made. And there's a question actually from Clara Feng about the lack of transparency or the gap to transparency still. What can be done to improve transparency from the government and the large companies so that international financiers such as yourself feel satisfied? Connected to that, PPEs. Do we need more uniform PPEs? Myanmar, for example, recently had a solar panel, solar energy bidding, and some complaints emerged, fairly or unfairly, about the non-standardized, unclear PPEs.
Okay. On transparency, I mean, I'm not, as a user of information, the availability of information and the granularity towards which the information is available is clearly important, because with information, we can carry out our analysis. So I think for Myanmar, for example, I don't know if there is in fact a sovereign debt rating that they currently have. So I think getting that would be a very important first step, because many private sector lenders actually rely on the analysis done by international rating agencies such as Moody's or S&P as a starting point for their own analysis. So I think that would be one one definitive step in improving transparency of government's credit profile, for example, as one of the many aspects of information on various governments. On your second question on PPEs, did you mean the PPPs?
Sorry, yes, the way the structures of the contracts are and off-takers, etc. So the terms are quite clear.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's clearly very important. The reason why there's so much money, not a lot of projects, it always comes back to the issue of bankability. And bankability actually really refers to the PPP structures that are utilized by these projects, right? So I do think that, getting this right at the outset is key. Making sure that there's transparency in sort of procurement guidelines is very important. I remember now you talked about the recent example of the solar tender. I think the manner in which that tender was done, it was done in a very abbreviated fashion. I think that definitely causes a bit of concern in the private sector. It is actually really important to bring in a wide range of many different companies from many different countries. They bring about a much more diverse set of thinking and approach in developing infrastructure projects. And I think if you demonstrate that the markets are truly open, that reinforces itself. It builds positive momentum. So I do think that's really important.
Thank you. There are a number of questions coming in, but I also have a question or hand up from Toru Furigori from the Japanese embassy here in Singapore. Can we open his microphone and allow him to ask his question on the chat? I mean, verbally. Toru-san, are you on? Hello?
Hello.
Hello, please go ahead.
Yes. Thank you for inviting such a great seminar. I'm very impressed with the presentation of the participants. So my question is how the connectivity of the Singaporean company and company in the developed company can be realized. So I'm very naive participant.
Well, thank you very much for that question. I think it's a very fundamental question.
Yes.
Given that we are both Singapore Institute of International Affairs, many Singaporean companies are here, but also many Japanese companies on the call which are based in Singapore. Yes, I have Audra. Audra, quickly, you mentioned that you support not only Singaporean companies, but also even foreign companies like Japanese companies with substantial presence here. Do you think this partnership can be deepened in the coming years? If so, what are some steps that could be taken to improve the partnership?
I think the partnership has been quite good. From what we can see, there are actually a lot of Japanese companies that have regional headquarters or operate out of Singapore with, obviously employing a lot of people here, which is actually what we care about. Whether or not this can be improved, of course, right, there's always scope to do more together. I think there's also scope for maybe even Singapore companies itself to partner with more Japanese companies because there are overlapping and complementary capabilities across the different firms. There is also quite a wide range of Singapore companies that are active in the same sectors that Japanese are, and I've already seen these collaborations firsthand in some of the projects. So for example, we've got a Singapore developer working with a Japanese EPC contractor to build power plants. So that's, I've seen that many times before.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Could I just turn to Kawai-san? Kawai-san, before going back to Japan, you were in the ADB Institute, you were World Bank as their chief economist for the region. But what do you think? You mentioned Suga-san's recent visit to Vietnam as well. What do you think of the possibility of collaborating between Singapore and Japan in some of the ASEAN third countries? You're muted, Kawai-san.
Yes, absolutely. Singapore has excellent companies. As Mr. Tay said, I think you said initially, very good logistics companies, excellent companies are there. And Singaporean companies know some ASEAN countries much better than Japanese companies. Collaboration between Japan and Singapore is very important at the private sector level and also at the government level. They share common approaches and common objectives by trying to help develop the neighboring countries and then try to benefit from that development. And Japan and Singapore are highly complementary. I don't think they are competing. They benefit a lot by working together.
Non-friendly competition is not a bad thing. Sometimes the recipient country will benefit. But could I ask a more specific question on the box from Kazuha Yoshimura-san, where he says, should we, ASEAN, Japan, or Singapore and Japan, have a joint target to provide capital over the next 5 or 10 years? either by country or industry by industry? Should we, in this form, moving the partnership ahead, should we try to think about actual measurable sort of KPI virtually of offerings to the infrastructure space? Anyone view on that? How do we progress the partnership?
Well, bilaterally between Japan and any ASEAN countries, a lot of discussions are going on, and they try to identify bankable and sustainable and high quality projects. I don't know if they have set up specific targets, X $1 million or X Y $1 billion, but they are now discussing very aggressively between the Japanese side and the ASEAN country side. Not only ASEAN, but other developing countries in the Indo-Pacific region.
Fumiharu-san, would you like to comment on this or relations of Singapore and Japan?
Okay.
Please go ahead.
Can I?
Please.
Okay, very quick. Actually, that in the private sector's investment route, I think that currently that joint investment of the Japanese side and the Singapore are very active, in particular to investment to the CLMV countries. Many Japanese investment companies, investment house are located in that Singapore, and they invest to the Myanmar, Laos, and something so forth, and many projects in particular the private sector space. So that probably that to encourage and promote such a movement, the policy harmonizations between the government of Japan and Singapore is very important. But I think it's still a very large trend of that. Okay.
So policy alignment, private sector partnerships don't need to actually set a number target. I think that's wise. A number target might be a bit overstretched.
Right.
We are almost out of time, but I think one important issue which all of you touched on, and it's featuring very strongly in our question and answers, I'm sorry we can't get to all of them, is about sustainability and smart cities. I think in some ways, Japan in its development over the last decades, and Singapore since our start under Lee Kuan Yew, has always emphasized sustainability of some kind. But Audra is correct. It's kind of a new additional quality environment, especially the climate part. I'm pleased to note, for example, in terms of exclusions, which Audra also mentioned, all three major Singapore banks and the MUFG Bank in Japan have excluded now carbon. But the energy transition is much broader, much more holistic, as Audra mentioned. Do you think this is an area where Japanese and Singapore can collaborate to help the energy transition and sustainability in our region, ASEAN? And if you could add whatever final comments you want.
Yeah, sure.
Kawai-san, please.
Sure. Well, as I explained, in the case of Tirawa SEZ, that's not only an industrial park, but the objective is to create a smart city. Singaporean companies are involved in some aspects, and more collaboration would be useful between Japan and Japanese and Singaporean companies. High tech, digital, and so forth. Environmental sustainability.
Fumiharu-san, would you like to comment on this? No, okay. Audra, I referenced you several times. Would you like to add something to what you said earlier?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a new, interesting area, and it really is one where people do need to work together on. Some of these sort of climate-friendly technologies are fairly established by now, solar, for example, but there are many others that are still not quite commercially viable at this point. So I think the way that is the way forward in order to sort of create that path to commercialization is governments actually need to come together and see if they can support some of these initiatives. And I think there's already some of this going on. We definitely see this in Europe, for example, where they're working on carbon capture technologies. Perhaps some of that can be also done from this part of the world. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much. I must apologize to all of us. It's my fault. Japanese are famously on time. Singaporeans quite good. I'm not so good, so we're a bit over time. But I really think we had a substantive discussion. I do also apologize to many people who asked questions we couldn't get to. Now, can I turn this back to closing remarks? Sarafim, what would you want us to do?
Yes, hi, thank you. Thank you to the speakers and everyone for joining us at today's webinar. Before we close off, can I request for all speakers and panelists to activate your cameras so that we can take a quick picture? So it would be Ambassador Sugawara-san, Jessica. Okay, Michelle, my colleague, will be taking the photo. Ambassador?
Ambassador ducked out for a while. You should have done this at the start.
Yeah, my apologies.
We're very lucky that we have 66 people still. I've been told actually that Ambassador back on. Let's take a photograph before I talk some more.
Okay, yes.
Okay, great.
All right, thank you. 1,
Thank you, Ambassador.
3. Shall we good?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, cool. We hope you have enjoyed today's webinar, and do continue to join us at our future events. We've got 2 coming up next week, which is the 7th Singapore Dialogue on Sustainable World Resources, as well as a dialogue on climate change between the EU as well as Singapore. So do keep a lookout for the invitations coming your way, and have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Yeah, I just said one more thing, and go for the thanks again to the Japanese ambassador, our panelists, and the audience who've stayed right to the end. Thank you all very much. It's been a very fruitful discussion. Thank you.